All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the September edition of our pasture management series. Quite a few things have changed, have come and gone since our August meeting, and conditions have changed, and weather has changed a little bit. Things that I might have told you to be looking out to doing in August have changed a little bit as far as maybe a little bit of the timing, and that starts to change as we go along the way. So we'll always get started with our agenda. What are we looking at? What are we seeing currently today? What should we be looking for over the next month? Things to be thinking about, things to be doing, and then take questions at the very end if you've got any regarding topics that we've talked about or anything down the line. So as we come in today, what are we seeing out there? And this is kind of a little bit of the opposite to some degree that we saw in our August meeting. We saw there's probably a little bit more moisture August. We were just getting through the middle of August where we got a little bit more rain. If I can remember, looking at the forecast for the following week after our first session, it looked like we had some more rain coming in. The weather was going to start to break. We were going to see a little bit cooler weather. And so some of the things that I had mentioned then, I was getting a little leery about because our weather was changing. But in the end, the weather has kind of fallen the way a lot of our Septembers fall, with it being a little bit hotter and a little bit drier. Actually, September is one of our drier months of the year, which we don't typically think about that. But right now, what are we seeing out there? A lot of dry soil, a lot of really dry soil. We had one of the last rains was, I believe, Saturday night, and that wasn't necessarily a widespread rain, and that wasn't necessarily a heavy downpour. Which has caused a lot of dry conditions, and breaking out of the 95-degree heat dried it out even further. So looking at this morning was a good example. Nighttime temperatures are starting to decrease pretty rapidly. Even if we don't stay the extreme of being down there right at 40 degrees, and if you're in a low-lying area, you might even touch it into the 30s. The decreased nighttime temperatures is really what's going to have the effect on a lot of the summertime grasses and weeds that we're starting to see out there. And so that's going to play a big role in what we're trying to do over the next month. We kind of alluded to it. Summertime grasses seem to be slowing, and that's key for if you're using those as the base for your pastures, for your grazing, or for hay. And also we're starting to see the weeds slow down. So this may play a role in if you're trying to do some reseeding. If you've kind of taken some of the steps we talked about last month, trying to take that process, do some reseeding, some overseeding, we're going to start to see some of those summer grasses slow down. They're not going to be so aggressive and trying to compete with any grasses that we may try to plant. And then we're also just looking at the increased cost of just inputs. If we're deciding to do some renovations, obviously cost is a real thing. We have to decide if the return on our pastures is worth the investment. Most of the time it still is, because the loss of it is much greater to the pocketbook than the expense it takes to maintain it. But we want to make sure that what we're doing is we're getting a fair return and that we're spending the right dollars in the right places. So we'll talk about a few of those, but that's what we're starting to see out there. That's what we have to try to work with as we currently sit here today. So what do we do? What do we do when we start going, okay, moving forward? So between now and the next month, what do we need to be looking at doing? There's quite a few things, and these are 5 that I really think we need to be looking towards. One being seed selection. If you're going to start to do some renovation, you've got to pick out what's the right seed, the right time, the right place for your operation, or for whatever you're trying to graze, or you're trying to do a hay field. You got to pick the right seed, and that could be sometimes that can be kind of a nerve-wracking time, because there's lots of options out there, and sometimes there's lots of names, but it's all the same seed. Next is you got to get the environment prepared. You got to get your seed bed prepared, because you can put a lot of money into seed, and if you put it in the right way or the wrong way, it can make all the difference in whether you get success out of that. So ground prep is one that we'll cover tonight. Just doing the seeding process. So not only getting the prep right, are you applying it in the right manner? Are you applying it the correct amount? Are you applying it the correct depth? We'll talk about a few of those. Number one thing, patience. If you don't have patience, it's really difficult to be able to get the expectations and the goals out of what you're trying to plant or what you're trying to control for your pasture. So that is one of the biggest things. And then we'll talk about probably what's going to occur most likely between now and our next meeting. We're going to see most likely our first frost. Traditionally, we see that sometime in mid-October. So we're going to talk about what does that mean? What is that going to, does that have any bearing on what we're trying to do right now? So as we look into it, we start talking about just seed selection. And this can be, this is, you're walking into a marketing concept for a lot of these things. And so it's like a lot of things. You can take the same product and you can repackage it, rebrand it in 10 different ways, and you're not really sure what you're buying and what you're getting. So we'll kind of walk through what you're looking to get, and then whatever bag you pick, as long as it's got those main ingredients, that's what we're looking for. So selecting the right location, the right purpose of our seed selection is very important. So when you're looking at location and purpose, we'll start there. Are you seeding a hay field? Are you seeding a pasture? That's gonna play a big role in the type of grass that we pick. When we're looking, and we're gonna kind of bounce back and forth between location and purpose, and we'll talk about perennials, some of your perennial options. When you're looking at a perennial option, that's a grass that when you plant it, it's established year after year after year. It does not die, hopefully. Most of them don't. It does not die when the seasons change. And so it is a grass that a lot of people like to have, not only because of cost, just because of time it takes to establish. So two of our biggest cool season perennials, so we're talking about cool season grasses right now. Two of them are fescue and orchard grass. And so when we're looking at, are we doing a hay field or are we doing a pasture, we have to look at what variety. If you're looking at planting orchard grass, which is a really great grass, both for the beef industry and for the equine industry, but especially equine owners, orchard grass just does not stand up to any type of grazing. So if you're going to graze with cattle or horses especially, orchard grass is not the grass to select for grazing. We would love to have it grazed, but as far as a cool season grass, it gets too stressed out during the summer months. And so anytime grass starts to get really stressed out, it starts to lose its ability to survive. And so what we found time and time again, for pastures, orchard grass just does not survive. So Kentucky 31 is by far our best cool season variety when it comes to establishing a cool season perennial grazing pasture grass. For hay, orchard grass is a good option for hay. Once again, it's still, even in the hay field, it still has a much shorter lifespan than Kentucky 31 fescue, but it can withstand being in a hay field. You're looking at probably 3 years being a good run for orchard grass before it really starts to thin out, and you have to do quite a bit of reseeding. But hay versus pasture is a big thing. Breeding. Are you doing any breeding? So this kind of really starts to reflect with a lot of our equine owners. So if you're doing any type of breeding, you really do not want to have a Kentucky 31, majority Kentucky 31 pasture if you're running a breeding operation. If you've got one broodmare, that might be a situation where you have at least one lot that has a warm season paddock. So during that last trimester for her, the last 2 to 3 months, you pull her off and put her on there. But one of the options we have to look at is fescue and broodmare. So that's something to consider as you walk through there. if you've got a breeding operation, you probably don't want to have a majority fescue pasture if you don't have an option to pull them off onto some warm season grasses. There's a lot of severe health problems that come with Kentucky 31 fescue and broodmares. And then on the weight gains on the cattle side, we also have issues with Kentucky 31. We kind of live with it and deal with it. But during the summer months, we see dramatically less gains because it does restrict blood flow for a lot of cattle, that they're not able to cool off quite as easy. So it does impact weight gains during the summer. So it's not something we can really avoid, because a lot of our pastures are based on fescue, but we sometimes do some different opportunities to add some clovers or things like that to dilute out that endophyte. And so kind of rolling right over to perennials, that's one of the issues that Kentucky 31 is it's got what we call an endophyte in it. This endophyte is this germ that allows the fescue, it's inside the seed heads, it allows the fescue to actually survive our summers when a lot of our other cool season grasses are not able to effectively withstand droughts, overgrazing, and that's what allows them to do it. Unfortunately, it's also what causes the red bag and broodmares and increased temperatures and blood restriction for cattle. So it's a good and a bad thing, but it's something that we've learned to live with. Now, there has been a lot of research over the past 20 years with Kentucky 31, where they've developed a few and have actually been able to remove and have found some new varieties of Kentucky 31. So Kentucky 31 endophyte positive is one that actually has the endophyte. One that's negative would be one that has the endophyte actually removed. They remove the endophyte from that. And what we found is when you remove the endophyte from the fescue, it actually loses its ability to survive in the sun. So if you start to see one that they have removed the endophyte free, that's actually a bad thing. It's just not going to last very long. It's going to mimic probably orchard grass in its ability to stand. And then there's a novel fescue that's out there. This novel fescue is probably 3 or 4 times as high as regular Kentucky 31 fescue. It still has the endophyte in there, but it's actually good endophyte, and so it does not impact the horses or the cattle that way. The problem is that you have to have a pure stand of this novel fescue. And if you have neighbors that live around you that have endophyte infected ones, that eventually will pass over into your stand. Or if you go mow a field that has the negative and then you have a positive, it will eventually infect that, and you're right back to where you started again. So it takes a very special case, and that might be a good opportunity to give the extension office a call if you're thinking about doing that, because you want to make sure that you get your return on dollar there. As you go into the annual grasses, thinking about those are going to be grasses that you plant this year, plant like this fall right now. They're going to be coming up, depending on the variety you have, early spring through late spring, and then they're going to die off when the heat starts to come on. When you're looking at that, the big difference between a lot of those is just the cost, the sheer cost of establishing those year after year after year, and the labor. There's quite a bit of labor, and you have to get the equipment to get them established. And then for a lot of people, you have to have the additional land to be able to pull them off to the side and hold that land free while you move your animals off onto another pasture. So what you're looking is all those costs of labor, land, and then what's your return. And so return is you get a pretty good quality, very high quality grass, and you get pretty good tonnage and pretty good amount of it. But the labor is a pretty big aspect of it. And then finally, a lot of people like to look at putting clovers in. They think about right now and think about clovers, and we get the question quite frequently, can I just mix my grass seed and my clovers together, and when I go ahead and plant this fall, and then I'll kind of knock 2 steps out with that one action? Clover seed and grass seed do not play well. clover seed is going to pop up a little bit faster, and so it's going to try to choke out the young grass seedlings. So if you're thinking about doing this, what I typically recommend is go ahead and put your grass seed in this fall, and then look at coming back in probably mid to late February, and then starting to throw your clover out there. And what that will happen is that's going to give that clover a chance to get up and get going amongst that established grass, and really get going before our cool season forages really start to take off with the spring months. If you wait too far into spring and the cool season forages really start to take off, the clovers will get choked out by those established forages. So everybody's trying to fight for their little bit of sunlight. So if you're looking at doing clovers in your pasture, we'll talk a little bit later in the year or early next year about when to plant those, but don't mix those. They don't typically play very well. So now we're to preparation. What do we have to do to kind of get prepared? So if you're looking at doing any type of reseeding, you're looking at two different options. You can drill it. And if you look at the picture with the tractor and the drill right there, that's seeding it directly into the ground. A lot of times we'll do no-till, but sometimes you can kind of prepare the ground. And then you're looking at broadcasting, where you're just throwing the seed on top of the ground. So when you're trying to decide which one of these is your option, part of it may be decided about your ability to get access to a drill. The others is getting somebody to custom do it versus broadcasting. So with drilling, you've got to have the right conditions. Right now, it's getting without rain. For some people, may be in a situation where it's just too dry. You may run, it has to use compression to be able to get the seed into the ground. And if it's not able to open up a really good seed bed, you won't be able to get that seed in. So if you have to put too much pressure on it to punch that seed in the ground, then you're looking at it's probably going to be really hard to get that seed up. So this is a good option if you want to no-till, so you don't have to do a whole lot of ground prep to get the seed in the ground. You can do that right with the no-till. For a lot of people, you're going to have to do some custom work. You're going to have somebody come out and do the custom work. Drills can be rented from a lot of the local co-ops, and one of the locations most people don't think about is the NRCS, which has an office in almost every county. So a lot of the NRCS offices have seed drills for rent if you would like. But we're looking at a seed depth of 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's one of the biggest challenges people have with getting seed drills, is getting them calibrated to the right depth. You always get it from somebody else. They may have had too much pressure, or the depth's too deep, and that can make all the difference between it succeeding and not. And then pasture quality. If you've got a really thick pasture with lots of big clumps of grass in there, you may not get a good return on your seed drill, because every time that tries to plant a seed in a clump of grass, you're not going to get really anything to come up. When you're looking at broadcasting, you've got to have the right conditions again, be able to get the grass seed to come up. This is a lot better if you've got difficult terrain. So for a lot of us, we've got some very hilly ground, and looking at the terrain, a seed drill can be very difficult. Or if you've got some really rocky terrain, seed drill can be very difficult to be able to move around and plant up and down. This is where being able to broadcast might be a little bit easier. You're going to get greater coverage. You're throwing that seed out, but what you have to remember is that you have to get it prepped. The ground has to be prepped, because if it's not falling into a soft soil seed bed, that seed is not going to come up. So I see time and time again where the seed is just thrown out on top of the hard ground and it will not come up. I don't care how many times people tell you, you're going to get very little germination when you start throwing the grass seed out on top of the ground. You have to be able to provide some sort of seed bed, whether it's with a drill. We'll talk a little bit about that, with a drill, and then actually covering it up. But it could be cheaper if you already own the equipment. The equipment can be pretty cheap. You can find some small disc, and a spreader with a rotary spreader can be fairly cheap, and then a cheap harrow or a chain link fence or anything like that. So it could be a little bit cheaper if you've got the equipment already ready to go, but you are going to get a little bit more variable because you're not getting consistent planting depth. You're not getting it consistently in the same seed bed and same situation. So looking at which one works best for you, there's a few things to look at and consider as you're going. But drilling is a great option if it works and if you have the ability to have the equipment or get somebody to custom do it and get access to the drill. So looking at actually doing the seeding, so we kind of, as we started to work our way into here, one of the big keys is prep, getting it done right. The seed will not grow on top of the ground, but it also doesn't grow when it's deep in the ground. So you really need to have a good preparation for that seed bed. Really spending a lot of time on the prep work on the front end will give you a lot better return. So one of the things I consistently talk about is if you'll just cut some splits. It doesn't have to be very deep. Like I said, a half inch, quarter of an inch. If you'll just scratch the ground to provide an opportunity for that seed to be able to hit some soil, broadcast your seed, and then if you'll take a chain link fence or a harrow or anything that will allow you to just drag back over the top of that seed, you'd like to see 3/4 of that seed covered up by dirt, where you can only see about a quarter of that seed sitting on top of the ground. If you can do that, you've set up a really nice bed for your seed to be able to get a good start. The key with covering it over, that provides a little bit of cover so the seed doesn't necessarily dry out near as fast if we have a period without rain. So disc it, broadcast it, and then come back over and cover it up to about 75 to 80% of the seed being covered up. Competition is key during this time. So these seeds starting to come up, we want to make sure that we have prepped it by clipping that grass down, which we talked about before, is get that grass about as low as we can so that when we put those seedlings in, they have a really good chance to get started and get going. Hopefully we did some weed control. If we had a higher pressure on weeds, we've slowed that down. The nighttime temperatures, like we just talked about, nighttime temperatures for some of these summer grasses and weeds is starting to come down. So that's going to slow a lot of those grasses and weeds down quite a bit. So we aren't going to have near that a competition for resources because they're kind of ending their time with us for this year. And then traffic, just keep as much traffic off of that newly planted seed as possible. Looking at the seed, getting the right amount is key. It's like Goldilocks. You don't want to put too little out there. You don't want to put too much. When you put too little is obviously an issue, but too much, if you way overseed, obviously it's a cost. But if you get a lot of seeds trying to grow up in the same space, you got to remember when that seed starts to grow, they're going to start eventually clumping out. So what you plant now is going to look completely different this coming spring when it starts to come up. So you need to make sure you give it the right amount. And so a lot of times that's 15 to 25 pounds per acre that you're looking at. Getting the right depth, 1/4 to half an inch is about as deep as you want to go. If you get much deeper than that, a lot of seed will not come up. Quite frequently, you see people put it in at an inch, and it's not necessarily intentional. Sometimes they're putting the drill in, and they don't pay attention to the pressure of the previous seed depth, and you turn around and you get seed that's an inch down, and a month later you come back in there and you can still find that seed still sitting there. So be able to take a little pocket knife and scratch through it and see, but looking 1/4 to half an inch. Once again, talking about contact, that soil, that seed has got to be in contact with a soft soil. It can't be sitting on top of this hard surface. It's just going to dry out and will never actually get going. And once again, we talk about moisture. So we want to make sure there's some moisture. So the hope is this weekend, we're going to get some pretty good moisture, and that'll be then a great time. We've got cooler temperatures. We got still daytime highs in the 70s. We got nighttime temperatures dropping down. This is really ideal for a cool season planting. So At this point in time, if we get some moisture this weekend, we're ready to rock and roll, and finish with just time. You got to be patient, and that's the number one thing. Is most people with lack the patience, and then you look at weed control. That's one of the big things that we talked about. If you go down the route of picking to reseed, you've elected not to do a lot of weed control after you got those seeds. So we're not really able to control a lot of the cool season weeds yet. We're going to have to wait further into winter, and we'll talk about that later, or into spring. So if you've planted, you're going to want to hold off till at least you probably have the ability to potentially cut. You're looking at probably, 6 inches at least before you want to come in there and do any type of weed control. So more likely, I say just kind of wait through the rest of the fall. We'll look at early winter as an opportunity to do some weed control. Patience. This is where we have to try it right here. And these percentages are not exact. This is more me giving you an estimate for demonstration purposes. But if you go ahead and plant your grass right now, you take your animals off, you plant your grass, and then you come back in 2 weeks and you put them back on there, you're going to probably get about a 10% success rate. The only place that is probably going to succeed is where the manure's at that they're trying to avoid. So if you're looking at doing it and you just say, hey, I can't keep my animals off, I don't have enough space, let's look at doing we can look at some alternative ways to be able to do it. And that's a good opportunity to reach out to us, and we can figure out specifically a game plan for you. But if you're just talking about in general, doing the whole field and you put them back on in 2 weeks, very, very slim margin that's going to actually survive. If you're looking at doing 1 month, you're looking at probably 20%. There's going to be a few more spots that cool season grasses have already started to come up. But if you can put them right back on there in 1 month, you're not going to get that much better of a success rate. You're going to get a few more spots that are able to survive and withstand them grazing on it, because they'll graze a few other things out there, but still a pretty small success rate for what you're doing. If you're going 5 months, and I'm basing that on October 1st, so 5 months puts us right to the beginning of March into February. If you put them out there, you're looking at 60% success rate. And so that 60% success rate is based on, we've got a really good stand, but a lot of our cool season forages at the beginning of March, even though it's starting to warm up outside, they're not really actively growing yet. Our cool season, especially a cool season perennial like fescue and orchard grass, is still going to be pretty dormant until we get higher soil temperatures, which are going to be mid to late March, probably more likely early April. So a lot of our fescue still has not got going yet. So these new seedlings have established a good root system, but they're not quite there yet where they're ready to take off with the warm weather. So if you can wait 1 more month, if you can wait into early April to put your animals back on this pasture, then you have a really high chance of success rate of being able to maintain that pasture through the spring, and you've really established it. You've given it the best chance to succeed. By that time, the warm season is hit. We've had a flush of probably some nitrogen added somewhere in there, whether it was through clovers. It's got a really good root system. It started to clump so that if there is some grazing there, it's able to have a good root system to withstand any type of grazing pressure that you may put on it. So this is a really good snapshot. So the more patience you have, the more ability you have to keep animals off of it for a longer period of time, the better chance you have for success. And then we'll conclude as we get to the last part of our program for this month. Is we're looking at probably mid-October, late October, we're going to see our first frost of the year. And what you're going to see when you wake up that morning is going to be this white covered field. And then by late afternoon and the following morning, day, what you're going to see is a pastures, yard, everything else that has a mixture of cool season and warm season grasses going on. What you're going to see is all the warm season grasses are going to be brown. So and all the cool season grasses like fescue are going to be green still. And so if you haven't had a really good opportunity, if you're having a really difficult time evaluating what your stand looks like, and you just weren't sure if you were going to do any reseeding this year, and you're thinking, okay, maybe next year, I just need to get a better feel for what I have. This is one of the best times to evaluate your pasture and get a feel for what your pasture has going on, because this is going to tell you right away if you've got a cool season grass versus if you have a warm season grass. And so this will help you identify what you have going on in the field, not necessarily specifically each one of them, but at least tells you, is my pasture mostly warm season, or is my pasture mostly cool season? So this is a great time to evaluate. Then for next year, at least you have a better idea. The cool season grasses are not going to reseed themselves over the spring or over the winter. So it's not going to be getting thicker. So you'll know next year, if you plan on doing some reseeding, you kind of have an idea where you're at. All right, so we've reached the end of the hour. And so once we conclude here, we'll take some opportunity to answer some questions after the recording. But for next session, we're looking at October 26th. We're going to cover kind of where our pasture statuses are at. Hopefully, we've done quite a bit of reseeding during that time. We've had some ideal times to do it. We're going to talk about some opportunities to add some infrastructure to our farms and pastures that can really help improve the quality of our pastures. And then we're going to look at possible options for weed control as we start to go into winter, and how we can be able to utilize those to maximize both control of the weeds and keeping control of our pastures. So thank you to everybody tonight. Once we stop recording here, then I will take questions. So hope everybody has a good night, and hope this was enjoyable. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out, whether it's for a farm visit or just questions about what's going on at your pasture.